Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Annie Wertz. She is research group leader of the MPRG Naturalistic Social Cognition at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. Her research investigates how infants and young children think about and learn from other people in naturalistic circumstances. Her work provided the first evidence that human infants do indeed possess behavioral and social learning strategies that are selective to plants. Examples: infants avoid plant dangers and selectively learn that some plants are edible. And today we're going to talk about that. So, Dr. Wertz, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, let's start with this question before getting into the specifics of to what extent children or infants are innately predisposed to pay attention to information about plants and how they acquire it and so on. Why is it that we have evolved specific cognitive abilities to selectively acquire information about plants?
Yeah, so I started working on this precisely because it touches on this issue of innateness versus learning. And so the argument for why I think human infants and humans generally have social learning mechanisms that are selective to information about plants is there are several ways to answer the question. So the first is to say, when you think about humans in modern environments, so in environments that most of us live in, plants are really something we probably don't think about very much, most of us, and they're not something that we necessarily engage with in a detailed way and in a meaningful way in our everyday lives. We might have houseplants, we might go to the grocery store and pick up things there, we might like walking through a botanical garden or something like that, but they don't really feel like a central part of human life. They feel like an afterthought. But if you expand your time horizon and you think about over evolutionary time, it immediately becomes clear that plants play a very different role in human life and have for most of our species history. So if you think about a hunter-gatherer world and hunter-gatherer existence, and depending on how you do the calculation, humans have spent between 90 to 99% of our history as a species as hunter-gatherers. Plants are really a fundamental part of human life. So plants are, of course, part of the environments in which humans directly live. Plants are food. Gathered plant resources form a basis of most human diets. And plants are used for a variety of different things. So they're used to make all kinds of different artifacts. They're used to for their chemical properties for things like hunting and fishing. And they're used for ritual properties and for medicines as well. And so humans really rely on plants. And in order to utilize plants, you're not going to a grocery store, you're not going to a hardware store, you have to actually go out into the environment and collect these things and collect the things you need. And if you start thinking about, well, how do you do that? That becomes a very difficult problem. And lots of plants look very similar. Plants themselves are in co-evolutionary relationships with all kinds of different species, most of which are insects. So they have very different sensory capacities than humans do. So what that means is, as a human, when you're looking at the plant world, there aren't features that immediately signal this plant is safe to eat, this plant is toxic. And instead, that information has to be acquired. You have to learn that information. And then the question becomes, well, how do you learn it? And one very important part about plants is that for all of these things they can do for us, they also can be exceedingly dangerous because lots of different animals eat plants. Plants really don't this is a sort of a colloquial way to put it, but plants really don't want to be eaten. Or if they do, they only want certain parts of themselves eaten during certain times of the year for seed dispersal and things like that. But if too much of a plant gets eaten, that's bad for the plant. And because plants are rooted in the ground, the way that they defend themselves from the things that eat them is they have evolved this just vast array of toxic chemicals that can deter herbivores. And some of those chemicals can be really harmful to humans, and some of them are fatal. So if you are trying to figure out which, as a human, if you're out in the natural environment, and you're trying to figure out which of these plants can I eat, which of these plants are going to kill me, one way you could do that is you could taste them for yourself and see what happens. But I would argue that that's not the best way to go about this, because if you do that, the best case scenario is that you're going to waste a lot of time, probably not feel very good. Your nutritional returns from that are probably not going to be very great. The worst case scenario is that you die. And so there are very high costs to making a mistake with plants. At the same time, the structure of that problem is actually similar to a lot of other problems, where what you would expect is the evolution of a social learning mechanism, where instead of engaging in trial and error learning, which is quite costly, instead the information is better learned from the more knowledgeable others in your environment. And so I started out with this proposal that in order to learn about plants, the cognitive architecture should fundamentally have this social learning structure, and that should balance the costs and benefits that plants pose for humans. And that started out just as the logic, and more recently, we've actually confirmed this prediction with some evolutionary modeling work in collaboration with an evolutionary biologist, so it falls out of the math too. So that's, I guess, the long argument for why I predict that humans should have some social learning structures evolved specifically for plants.
Mm-hmm. And what are the ways people categorize plants? I mean, what are the different ways they do it?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and it depends on what you mean by categorization. So there's one way to think about the problem, which is how do people recognize what thing in the world is a plant versus all of the other kinds of things that you can encounter in the environment. So how do you categorize plant versus non-plant? And then there's another way to think about it, which is there are all these different plant species, and these are ones I can eat, these are ones that are going to harm me, and how do I, as a human, how do my cognitive structures make that distinction? My team has been working on both of these, and so for the first question, in terms of how do humans categorize plants from non-plants, we don't have a clear answer yet. So we know from our research that it's not just simple things. So it's not just the presence of green, for example. It's not just the presence of leafy shaped things. Because we have control objects in our studies where we work primarily with human infants and young children, so we present them with these different objects and we see how they respond. And when we present them with plants, which are green and leafy, infants in general take longer to reach out and touch green and leafy plants. But when we present them with control objects that are not plants but are nevertheless green, or they are nevertheless leafy, infants reach for those really quickly. So it's not just these simple single features. It must be that there's some combination of elements, and we're working now on really trying to figure out what that is. It's a very important question. Mm-hmm. For the second question, we have a little bit more traction on that. So how do infants specifically distinguish different types of plants? And one of our first studies in this area suggests that infants, when it comes to plants, they pay attention to really fine-grained features. So they pay attention to things like leaf shape and more subtle variations in leaf shape. Whereas if you, again, present those exact same features in a different context, so you present them as part of a man-made object instead, infants don't attend to those features anymore, and they attend to the overall shape. So there seem to be different cues that infants are sensitive to when they are categorizing plants versus other things. And now this falls out of directly what I was talking about before, is that the distinctions between plants, making the distinction correctly is very important. And many plants can look similar. And in fact, there's even strategies that plants have to protect themselves, where edible plants evolve to look like poisonous plants so that they kind of protect themselves. So the distinctions really can be quite subtle. It suggests that that the structure, the design of a cognitive mechanism for distinguishing between plants should pay attention to these very fine-grained features, and that's what our work suggests so far.
So I have this question saved for later on in the interview, but perhaps this is a good point to ask it. So we have core knowledge, right? I mean, some anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists do work on this. They usually subdivide it into folk biology, folk physics, folk psychology, or theory of mind. So this knowledge that infants acquire about plants, does it fall under the rubric or is perhaps a subdomain of folk biology?
Yeah, this is a good question. So I think that if you are coming at this from the perspective of somebody who is a core knowledge theorist, I would think it probably falls within the category of folk biology. But the way that I approach things is I think about things more in terms of adaptive problems and what kinds of more specific solutions would evolve. And so if coming at it from the perspective of core knowledge, if the idea is that there's knowledge about biological things, then plants would certainly be part of that category. At the same time, though, in my view, the core knowledge approach generally has tended to focus in the sub area of folk biology. It's really tended to focus, for good reasons, on what are the commonalities between plants and animals. So when do children understand that plants and animals are both alive? When do they understand that both of these things grow, that they heal, that they, after being injured, that they need to eat? These kinds of questions. And that's all I think that's interesting, and that's certainly very important. But for my purposes and where I come from, theoretically, I think more about, well, what do people have to do with plants? What are the kinds of problems that they have to solve? And in those cases, there's actually a lot of ways that plants and animals are different in meaningful ways, and that therefore the kinds of interactions you would have with them would be very different. And then in my view, the kinds of cognitive structures that would evolve to handle each of those problems are likely very different. So to the degree that folk biology allows for differences between plants and animals, then my work could fit into that category. But to the degree that specialization within that is, especially particularly when we get down into infancy, to the degree that that's inconsistent, then maybe it's a little bit more of its own thing.
So, I mean, what you're saying is that within core knowledge, we have the domain of folk biology, and the core knowledge theorists tend to group plants and animals together and basically try to understand how people distinguish between living and non-living things.
Yes. Yeah, it's really a focus on the commonalities, and that history, that intellectual history, goes back even to Jean Piaget, where he talked about, kind of a mature understanding is of basically what's come down through is that a mature understanding of a biological thing is that plants and animals do have a lot in common, that they are both living things, and that's kind of like the pinnacle of what you want to understand. But from my perspective, if you want to understand how does an infant come to learn that this is the kind of plant in their environment that they can eat, right? So this is a fundamental question for how do you become a successful hunter-gatherer forager, right? You need to learn this information. Does it matter that they view the plant as alive or not? Maybe, maybe not. But more importantly, it matters. It's the problem is different because the plant has different affordances, let's say, than an animal. So if you are learning about plants, and you have dangerous plants and edible plants, and then you have animals, and you have dangerous animals, and you have non-dangerous animals, learning about a dangerous plant, for example, is a very different problem. So a dangerous animal, you could get seriously injured. This thing could come and get you in the middle of the night, or while you're walking out in the world. A plant is not going to do that. A toxic, deadly plant is not going to hurt you unless you approach it first. So the fact that it is literally rooted in the ground makes the problem of learning about that danger a very different thing than learning about, say, a spider or a snake or a large predator of some kind. And so there you have both of these things within the domain of biology. You have a dangerous plant, you have a dangerous animal, you're learning danger about both things, but the structure of that problem, in my view, is different because of there are real differences between plants and animals.
Yeah. So earlier I've asked you how people categorize plants. Do we know if there are important cross-cultural differences in how people do it?
So people have looked at this. In my own work, we haven't looked at categorization per se. Cross-culturally, we've looked at responses to plants in a couple of different places, but there is work that has been done by people in folk biology, and then of course there's there's a huge amount of work within anthropology looking at how children and adults interact with and catalog and engage with plant resources. And so a lot of times that work is done not necessarily to look at plants per se, some of it is, but a lot of it is looking at foraging returns more generally, or those kinds of broader questions. But nevertheless, there's a lot of information about this. So in the folk biology world, what is clear from those studies is that, of course, it makes a difference where you are and what your interactions with plants are, how you think about and how you categorize plants. So what seems to be generally the case is that so even just looking within Western cultures, let's say, if you look at urban environments versus more rural environments, children in more rural environments seem to have a richer representation and richer categorization of the natural world, including plants, than children who are growing up in urban environments. And then those same studies, if you look at children who are growing up in the US, for example, and then you compare that to children who are growing up in indigenous communities who are still practicing hunting and gathering or small-scale horticulture, you see that the children and the adults in the indigenous societies have really, really rich representations and categorization structures for plants that we're really missing in societies that are more urbanized and more removed from nature. So it certainly makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. So let's now get into some of the specifics regarding the developmental psychology side of things here. Is there a specific age at which infants develop, or the capacity for infants to acquire information about plants comes online?
So in our research, we have tested infants about as young as 5 to 6 months of age. That's as young as we've tested given the measures we've used. And even those infants show some degree of specialization. So we can say that at least by 5 to 6 months of age, infants are showing some evidence of this. It's not clear when you would be, if or when you would be able to find evidence of that earlier. The question always is, though, and this is true of any infant study, the question always is, are you seeing, if you're seeing that infants have this capacity very early in life, or you're seeing evidence of this capacity very early in life, is it because infants are using it in the moment and it's something that they need then? Or are you seeing the early developmental stages of something that you see some degree of specialization that may need to be there that early in order to kind of build something that's only useful later on? So I've thought about, for my own work, I've thought about the question of, are the things we're seeing, are they actually useful for infants in the moment? And I would argue that the behavioral avoidance that we see, so that we see this general pattern of infants are reluctant to touch plants compared to other objects, and they touch them less frequently once they interact with them. And we also see that they look more to adults before they touch. My argument would be that that is something that's useful for infants in the moment, right? This is something that's keeping them safe as they are infants. At the same time, do infants need to be able to identify an edible plant when they're 6 months of age? Maybe not. I mean, maybe it helps. Lots of times infants go along on foraging trips, but but I think that it's more likely that that's something that's probably only useful when older children, in some cases that's as young as 2 to 3 years of age, but still older children actually start to go out and do foraging themselves.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that it is correct to say that this ability to acquire information specifically about plants is innate in humans?
Well, this is where it really depends on what you mean by innate. And so I think most folk notions of innate have the flavor of it is fixed, it's inflexible, it doesn't develop over time, it's present at birth, for example. And I would explicitly not subscribe to that version of innateness.
Okay.
Because this is one of the main reasons I started doing this research project is because I think that version of innateness, it probably does not broadly apply to a lot of things, because developmental systems are designed specifically to be plastic and to be responsive to the environment. Even a developmental system that produces the exact same outcome in essentially all humans, that system requires input from the environment to develop. So you can think about vision, for example. Vision doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would be heavily dependent on the environment. But of course, if there's no visual input into a child's eye, their vision doesn't develop. So even things that seem very inflexible, seem very fixed, you need to have the interaction with the environment for the developmental process to unfold. With plants specifically, what I think about more is that this is a reliably developing system. So this is some part of human cognitive architecture. My argument would be that it is something that, to a first approximation, all humans share. But because of the way that plants can vary, because by hypothesis, this kind of system, it should be sensitive to the social and cultural environment in which the child is growing up. My starting point for this is that the structure of the mechanism itself may vary in systematic ways across individuals based on that kind of input. So for example, all infants could come into the world with a simple rule, for example, of if it's a plant, don't touch it, and then learn which plants are safe. So that very simple structure, everybody can have that same structure. But then what the knowledge bank that's built based on that very simple structure is going to vary systematically depending on the culture, also on the structure of the environment itself. How safe is it to move around the environment? What kinds of plants are there? And so I probably, my specific way of thinking about this probably doesn't fit neatly into innateness per se. I would rather use reliably developing.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps this is related to that. When acquiring information from other people about plants, I mean, how and what information do infants acquire? I mean, when people are, for example, talking about plants or exposing them to certain plants, what aspects of what people say about plants do infants tend to pay attention to, or do they pay attention to everything people say about them?
This is a good question. So because we work with infants, most of what we have done is not verbal information, because our typical subject population is kind of between this 5 to 6 month age range until about 18 to 20-ish months. So the younger infants really aren't verbal at all. Instead, what we do is we demonstrate different kinds of actions for them. And so what our research has focused on, one could imagine there are many different things that humans broadly should be sensitive to with respect to plants. And I think that those would fall out of the broad categories I mentioned at the beginning of the interview of what can be eaten, how do you process this thing so that it can be eaten, how can this be used, how do you process this thing so that it can be used, which of these things are dangerous, if it's something dangerous, but nevertheless I need to interact with it, how do I do that? So that is the general type of information that I think is likely to be prioritized with plants. For the specific things that we've tested, because I mean, to my knowledge, when it comes to infants, I'm pretty much what I started. To my knowledge, we were the first ones kind of really working on this. So I just have some of the first steps that we've managed to do. And that is, we started with edibility. So information about whether a particular plant could be eaten. And then we also have some preliminary looks at information conveying safety. So the way that we did edibility is we showed infants a display where we had, so when you test infants, basically, because they can't talk, you have to set up visual displays for them or actually provide them with objects, and then you measure what they do, mainly what they reach for and what they look at. And so in the studies that we have done looking at edibility, what we do is we have an actor on a stage. The infant sits and faces the actor and watches what is going on. The actor has two objects next to her. So she has on one side, she has a plant that has some fruits on it. On the other side, she has a control object that has the same features. There's different ones for different conditions, but in the main condition, it has the same, it's made out of the same stuff as the plant, but instead of being green, the leaves are painted silver. They're presented in a glass case so that it destroys the overall shape of the object. And then we have different color fruits on that. And then what happens is the infants watch the actor perform an action that could indicate that something is edible. And that just is very simply picking off a fruit and putting it in the mouth. So just like that. And then in these studies, we showed the actor doing the exact same thing with the plant and with the novel object that's matched to features of the plant. And even though infants saw that exact same social information with both of these objects, their patterns of reaching and then their patterns of visual attention indicated that they nevertheless viewed the plant as the thing that's being edible. So they seem to be particularly tuned to this information about edibility. And I have some work that I did with one of my postdocs, Camille Ryu, where we've actually looked at whether not just the edibility action itself, but the outcome of past actions that could indicate edibility infants would be sensitive to those. So for example, if you, instead of a whole plant, you have a piece of fruit that's been picked off, or you have a piece of fruit that's been cut up as if somebody's preparing it to be eaten. And what we see is that infants tend to respond to those differently than the whole plant. So they seem to be able to make inferences based on both seeing an action itself and then also, in some cases, inferring the action. For the safety studies, what we did for those is that we just showed an infant and adult touching a plant and then reacting to it. And if infants witness an adult touch a plant, their reluctance to approach that plant themselves is significantly decreased. And there's no effect on other objects, it's just the plants, it really reduces their reluctance. So infants, our work shows that infants seem to be particularly attuned to physical cues of edibility and of safety.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because when it comes to these questions surrounding innateness, for example, I remember studies that have nothing to do with plants in this case, but for example, people that exposed, I think it was chimpanzees to other conspecifics having fear reactions to, for example, a rabbit or a snake. And the younger ones, for example, if you condition a chimpanzee to have a fear reaction to a rabbit, even if other younger ones see it having that, they don't acquire or develop a fear reaction to a rabbit. But when it's to a snake, then they learn to have that fear reaction, let's say. So,
Yes.
I mean, there are aspects of human and animal psychology in general, where it seems that there is some innate psychological predisposition toward, acquiring certain kinds of information or paying attention to some aspects of the world more than others, and even completely ignoring some social information. So I don't know if that would also apply in this case.
Yes, I think it exactly does, and then this is what I was referring to. Is it depends on what your definition of innateness is, right?
Mm.
So if your definition of innateness includes present at birth, then what you just described doesn't count as innateness, right? Because the fear itself is not present at birth. The
Yep.
fear is an outcome of this reliably developing mechanism that's tuned to looking out in the world for specific kinds of signals, but it's only once that signal is observed that the fear is actually, I mean, you could say turned on, it's learned, however you want to think about it. But I think that structure that you describe is exactly what I'm positing for plant edibility, that the part of human psychology is, and I mean, this is another case where I talk about this as I study how humans think about plants. But one of the reasons plants are very interesting is because they actually intersect with a lot of these bigger questions. So they intersect with questions of how do humans learn about dangerous things? How do humans learn about food? I mean, food learning is its own huge thing, and it includes certainly more than just plants. But my argument is that certainly for plants, what humans have is this, you can think about it as a selective learning, prepared learning, for monitoring the environment for evidence that a plant is something that can be eaten. And once that evidence is observed, there's a different kind of inference made, a stronger inference that infants are picking this up. They're basically designed to pick up this information about plants.
Yeah, we will get into those more broader, bigger questions and how cognition related to plants might connect to other aspects of human cognition later on in the interview. But let's just take a step back and let me ask you, so when infants acquire information about plants, do they take some initiative? Like, for example, do they try to explore and experiment themselves with plants, or do they wait for other people to present some sort of information, as, for example, in the studies you just described, to them, and only after that do they try to experiment themselves with them?
Yeah, so the totality of our experimental evidence at this point suggests that the way that in general infants approach plants is that when they don't have any information about a plant and it is placed in front of them, the first thing that they do is they look up at the adult in the room, and mostly that because of the way that we do the experiments, that's mostly the experimenter that's sitting across from them, but sometimes they turn around and look at the parent. So the plant is there. The first thing they do is look up at the adult, and then after that they touch, basically. So the delay, at least for infants in the US and infants in Germany, the delay basically seems to be to check and look and see, okay, is this something that I can interact with? And if the adult doesn't stop them, then they go for it. And what we've seen is that so we have this finding that infants take longer to touch plants. When we look at the amount of social looking that infants do, we find that the amount of social looking isn't just a consequence of how long they take. It seems to be independent of that. If you control for the different lengths of time before touching objects, infants really seem geared to just check to see what to do. We also have some evidence from studies we did where we had parents and toddlers out in a garden just around our institute. And we didn't give them any instructions. We just had certain plants selected for them. We would take them there. We would say, this is a lavender plant. Just introduce this to your child, interact any way you would like. And then we just turned our cameras on and saw what happened. And what we saw in that naturalistic setting is that the toddlers still tended to wait for their parents to interact with the plant before they did themselves. So it was much more likely that the adult would do something first than that the child would do something first. And this was true of behaviors that weren't touching. This was also true of things like behaviors where they're smelling the plants and things like this. So the evidence we have suggests that they are waiting for somebody else to give them a signal before they go ahead and explore themselves. But then once they do, then they do explore. So we are actually currently looking now at what kinds of exploratory behaviors they do. So are they using tactile kind of cues? Are they kind of feeling what the plants feel like? Are they are they using olfactory cues? Are they focused on visual cues? How does that all go together? So that's an ongoing project that we don't have the answer to yet.
So let me ask you a specific thing. The kind of evidence you're describing and the studies you described before, I mean, because we're talking here about about human universals as well. I mean, how people deal with social information, information about plants, how they categorize information. I mean, have these studies been done only in weird societies, weird samples, or also done and replicated in other kinds of cultures?
So we have had two projects with collaborators where we have looked at this in non-weird samples. So the first project, we collaborated with Clark Barrett to look at this among the Shuar. And then the second project, we collaborated with Frida McNamara to look at this among the Aitaukai Fijians. And so what we saw in those studies is we saw actually some interesting similarities, but we also saw some differences. So for example, the Shuar infants, like the German infants and the US infants, were quite reluctant to touch all plants. So we tested several different categories, but they in fact, and in fact for the Shuar infants, the way that we ran this, they actually, so in our US and German samples, we tended to see a delay to touch. With the Shuar infants, they just wouldn't touch it at all. It was more of a binary yes or no kind of decision. But for the Fijian infants, what we saw was that they were less likely to touch an unfamiliar plant. So basically, in both of those societies, we tested some familiar plants and some unfamiliar plants, some real plants and some fake plants. And what we saw for the Fijian population, so for the Shuar, they were reluctant to touch them all. But for the Fijian infants and young children, they were particularly just reluctant to touch the unfamiliar fake plant. So we saw it's a fascinating pattern because it shows that it's not just engagement with the natural world at a broad level that is shaping infants and young children's responses in these societies. It has to do with the particulars of the society. And it's still very much an open question about what those are. So we know US and German infants are very similar. Shuar infants share some similarities with US and German infants, and the Fijian infants are behaving a little bit differently. And so now the goal is to try and figure out, try and identify what particular features we could look at that would give us a clue as to what exactly is driving that, because it's an important part of understanding what the developmental process is for this kind of mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, determining what are the human universals out there is still an ongoing project, right?
That's right. And the idea would be that, as I said before, that so for all of those infants across all of the four societies, that they all come equipped with this simple set of reluctance to touch plants, which can then be overturned with social information, right? But then what social information are they getting? What kinds of plants are they being exposed to? What is the local ecology? Are the plants that are there really generally pretty dangerous, or are they generally pretty safe? I mean, you can imagine that the environments that a Shuar infant growing up in the Amazon in Ecuador, it's a very different situation than an infant growing up on the beach in Fiji, right? So there's a lot of things it could be, and I wouldn't foreclose on it, but I would say, I would argue that the capacity, the underlying capacity is the same, but what gets built by that specialized set of rules is different depending on the culture and the social and the ecological environment.
Mm-hmm. So let's say that an infant acquires information about one particular plant. Yep. Is he or she able to generalize from that plant to a similar looking plant?
Our results suggest that they are. So we have done these findings, or excuse me, we have done these studies primarily with 18-month-olds, and what we found is that, for example, information about edibility, if you show an infant that one type of plant with one type of leaf and a particular type of fruit color, if you show that one is edible, but a different plant with a different leaf shape and a different fruit color, if you don't provide any information about that one, so you pick fruit off one and go, pick fruit off the other, go, and put it down, infants will then view a different instance of the plant that was eaten as also being edible. So infants are generalizing. If they learn about this particular plant is edible by 18 months, they are able to correctly generalize that to similar looking plants. And then the studies that we have done that I mentioned looking at the fine-grained features, that's also with 18-month-olds. And that's instead of edibility information, we did that with names. So the names of plants, because there's a tradition of using word learning to look at categorization. And so what we found is that by 18 months, infants are also able to generalize names of plants functionally across similar looking plants.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we've already talked about core knowledge, human universals, innateness. So another big question now. Can we say that the human mind is adapted to dealing with plants?
So I would argue that yes, it is. And I would argue that the empirical results I've generated so far are consistent with this proposal. Although I would certainly acknowledge that we're still, even though I've been doing this now for, I guess a little over a decade, nothing we have, I would say, is completely conclusive, because you can always find counter explanations for any particular set of results. That said, I would say that the totality of the evidence we've collected suggests that there is specialization and selectivity, even in infancy, towards interacting with and learning about plants. I would also say, just from a broader perspective, I mean, even though if you look at across the fields of cognitive science, developmental psychology, philosophy of mind, the kinds of things that people tend to engage with generally don't have anything to do with plants, the kinds of topics that people engage with. But if you take a slightly different perspective and you step back and you say, well, what's the likelihood that a particular organism has cognitive adaptations for one of its main food sources? The answer should almost certainly be yes. And so I think that this is another reason I chose to work on this topic, is I think unlike some other things, there's very, very, very good evidence in the archaeological record that humans relied on plants. It's uncontroversial that plants are everywhere. I mean, I think you're on I at least think I'm on pretty solid footing with the theoretical background for this, that this would be a likely area for this. And I think that the data we've collected so far is consistent with that proposal.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that being adapted to dealing with plants manifests in terms of aspects of our senses as well, right? For example, vision, olfaction, touch, perhaps, or not?
Yeah, so I think that that's almost certainly the case. And I haven't studied any of those things directly, but there is evidence. So, for example, there's arguments that color vision came about in response to the problem of ripening fruits and identifying ripening fruits. There is the longstanding claim that the perception of bitter tastes is actually about avoiding plant toxins, and so rejecting bitter tastes is one way to try and avoid ingesting incredibly dangerous plants. But then for other things, I would argue things like, for example, smell. So as I mentioned, we saw that there was a lot of olfactory behaviors that were happening in these studies where we had parents and children outside in the garden. We were actually a little bit caught off guard by that, because in a laboratory setting, you really think about how do you control all these different factors, but out in the world, smell seemed to be having this very important component. And when you're trying to tell apart these very similar looking entities, it makes sense to have kind of a multi-sensory way of exploring them. And looking into the literature, there's evidence suggesting that humans can differentiate over 1 trillion different scents. I wonder to what degree the kind of specificity that you see in some of these sensory areas is in some way related to this fundamental issue of having to make a living off of this particular kind of entity that is a plant that has these very specific problems related to it.
Mm-hmm. So by studying how people and infants more specifically process and acquire information about plants, can that inform, for example, study designs and theoretical approaches to learning more about cognitive mechanisms that are specialized to dealing with other kinds of information, like, for example, since we talked about core knowledge, information about animals, about other people, about non-living objects, and so on?
Yes, I think that it can. And I think that there are a few ways that I would hope that the kind of work I'm doing is useful to that. The first is that I hope that, particularly when it comes to infant studies, that this kind of approach, and this is consistent with what people in other areas are doing, but that this kind of approach really helps people to think about not looking for kind of fixed, inflexible, no development, like when are things present, but instead thinking more over the course of even early development. What kinds of information might a cognitive system initially be sensitive to? How could that cause developmental changes? What kinds of flexibility would you expect to see either across an individual's early childhood or their lifespan? What kinds of patterned differences might you see across different kinds of cultural contexts? So I hope it would inform thinking about that. I also hope that it could serve as an example of looking for something that people hadn't really thought to look for. Like it was not really another reason I really like this topic is because there's not a lot of people doing it, especially not thinking about plants on their own. And I think that when you start thinking deeply about what are the real problems in natural circumstances and everyday circumstances with interacting with any kind of entity. So interacting with another human being, interacting with an animal, interacting with foods, interacting with inanimate objects, when you really dig down into what has to be achieved, what kinds of information needs to be taken into account, how would that change over the course of the lifespan, having some specificity and thinking deeply about those problems can take you in interesting ways in interesting directions that people generally don't think about. So I hope it also provides that example. There's an awful lot in human cognition that's really genuinely, truly fundamental to human cognitive abilities that I think we just haven't gotten to yet because we focus on this one subset of topics. So I hope this is an example of there's a lot here that we can still explore.
Do you think that by learning more about these aspects of human cognition related to plants specifically, but cognition more generally, we can also acquire more information or at least get another source of information about the kinds of environments we evolved in?
That's a very good question. So in principle, I think that may be true. I think in general, those kinds of inferences are tricky, depending on how specific you want to be. So I think one thing that this is a little bit off the top of my head, but just one thing that I think it would shed light on potentially is what's the kind of variability in the kinds of or what's kind of the plant variability that people encountered, right? And I say plant variability as a very broad category because there is, how many different plant species have people encountered? What proportion of those are dangerous? What proportion of those are edible? What would be the kind of change in plant species that a human walking around as opposed to using modern transportation might encounter. So I think in principle, if I can do my job well enough and map out this system well enough, in principle, you might be able to get some traction on some of those issues. But for my own work, generally, I tend to go the other way. So I tend to use, what we think we know about ancestral environments in order to make predictions that I can test in living humans now.
Mm-hmm. So let's get now in the last part of the interview into some more general and theoretical questions. So regarding cognition about plants specifically, how do you look at the interplay between evolutionary and developmental factors here?
Yeah, so when approaching this topic frankly, I think when approaching any topic, it requires keeping two timescales in mind. So, and the two timescales really are fundamentally linked because evolutionary processes don't build static, stable outcomes. Evolutionary processes build developmental systems. I mean, we all start out as an egg and a sperm, right? That's not the end state. What gets built is what's selected for is the developmental cascades, right? And so I think that if you are a psychologist, for example, who's very interested in mapping something in an adult, that's great. But eventually, for a full accounting of that system, you do then also have to think about what is the development of this evolved system over the course of the individual's lifespan. Mm-hmm. And so it adds an additional layer of complexity to think about this, because how these develop. So first, how the evolutionary processes unfold can be quite complicated, and then how developmental processes unfold can be quite complicated too. So I think what it means is for all of us, we have a lot of work still to do to have a full accounting of whatever system we're doing. But this is why I also think it's useful to go through the difficulties of studying infants, for example, because it's a lot easier, in my view, to think about the developmental trajectory and the developmental processes when you're already dealing with something that is very clearly developing, right? And so this is where thinking about some of the things that we discussed before about, okay, is the behavior I'm seeing in my study, is that something that's reflective of a cognitive capacity that's useful for the infant right now? Could this be a building block for later? What kinds of information, what kinds of influences would I expect would cause development in this particular system? So to approach this problem, one definitely has to keep both of those very complicated timescales in mind. But that's what I think is fun to do. But it doesn't, what I will say though, it doesn't lead to a lot of satisfying answers. It's a lot of, well, you have to think about this and we have to look at this and it's certainly a larger project than any one individual can finish in a lifespan. But if you can kind of lay some of the building blocks, maybe people later on who are better than you and smarter than you can figure out some of the next steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also asked you that because, of course, these are the kinds of questions where interdisciplinarity comes into play. And, for example, we might get together evolutionary psychologists and developmental psychologists, anthropologists as well, of course. But, sometimes people bring to the table different approaches, different perspectives, different theoretical frameworks. For example, the evolutionary psychologists perhaps tend to be a little bit more focused on what is universal about the human mind, the universal cognitive mechanisms, and perhaps tend to think more in terms of what is innate, or at least what we are psychologically predisposed to, even if it comes online just later on in our lives. And perhaps there are developmental psychologists who are more focused on socialization and social learning, and perhaps are not too convinced about the innateness of certain cognitive mechanisms, for example.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I can say, my own kind of academic identity is that I am both an evolutionary psychologist and a developmental psychologist, in the sense of I'm an infant researcher. I come out of the cognitive development tradition, and particularly, I think that there has started to be more crosstalk across disciplines. I think it's been very, very, very useful. So, for example, I have seen just in over the course of my own career that there has been a shift in the cognitive development world where now there is movement towards looking at exactly what are the cultural influences on even these core knowledge systems. So it started out basically with what you were suggesting is everybody's looking at, what is sort of the innate piece of this that's shared. And now there is a move towards looking more in this cultural direction. At the same time, in the evolutionary world, there were very few people who were doing anything developmental in the evolutionary world for a long time. And I think that over the last, 10 to 20 years, you've seen many, many more people who have started to take a developmental perspective within the evolutionary world. And I think it's been incredibly useful. And I hope anyway, that my research kind of stands at that intersection and is accessible to both of the areas that we've been talking about, and maybe could help bring those together even more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, culture is something we haven't talked about a lot during our interview. I mean, I mentioned that bit about studying weird and non-weird cultures, but apart from that, we haven't talked about it too much. So, how do you look at different approaches in the evolutionary sciences? Because we have, for example, evolutionary psychology, and we have a cultural evolutionary theory, and sometimes, I mean, they get into not necessarily, but sometimes they get into conflict with one another, particularly when it comes to explaining certain aspects of our psychology. So do you think they can complement each other?
Yes, absolutely, I do. And I've been fortunate to actually collaborate with Christina Moya, who is a cultural evolution person, on writing a paper on pretty much exactly this. I think I can say this. I think Christina has said this too. So we wrote a paper that was basically trying to find some common ground between exactly evolutionary psychology and cultural evolution. And one of the most fascinating things to me writing the paper, and I believe Christina shared this too, was actually our discussions in the comments on the margin. So as we were writing this paper and we're trying to find these commonalities, we would come to these places where it seemingly we didn't agree. And then we would kind of explain what each of us meant by this. And we both really got a different view, I think, on kind of how the terminology is used, what the assumptions are. And I think that I think that this is one of these things that I've really seen change. I started as a graduate student in 2003, and I have really seen the change from the kind of camps within the evolutionary social sciences being kind of very cordoned off, and as you say, in some cases antagonistic, to move towards more conceptual and methodological integration. And I think that there is every reason that evolutionary psychology and cultural evolution inform each other incredibly well. I think that because humans are just the kind of culture that humans build, the complexity, the fact that it persists over these giant populations, this is very unique. We're very different. We're a very different kind of animal with respect to the way that our culture is structured. And so I think that means that there are going to be very few areas of human psychology where it doesn't make sense to think about what the cultural environment is. And so, I think this is where collaborations can be very, very useful, because my expertise is in thinking about and researching empirically what the structure of the psychology is. I don't have the expertise to model cultural evolutionary processes, but it is certainly the case that, for example, with plants, the cultural information about plants that applies to plants is actually massively complicated. And so understanding how that looks, understanding the kind of cultural traits that are there in particular societies and how those can evolve, I don't think you can fully understand the psychology without understanding the culture, and I don't think you can understand the culture without understanding the psychology. So I think they complement each other extremely well. I look forward to moving. So because I work with infants, we really worked in these very basic kind of things. So showing that a fruit is edible by picking it off a plant and putting it in your mouth. But of course, if you look at ethnographies, if you look at how people just generally eat things, there are so few plants that we eat just by picking off a fruit and eating it, right? Most food resources, plant food resources that humans eat require enormous amounts of processing and really complicated processing steps and things that can take weeks or months. And they're exactly the kinds of things that cannot be discovered by one individual. They have to be a product of culture and cultural evolution, interfacing with human cognitive architecture. And so understanding, really taking what I'm doing further up in development and looking at how this kind of information interfaces with the psychology, the plant specific psychology, I think will be a very interesting way to go forward.
Mm-hmm. But when studying cognitive design, do you think that for any sort of cognitive mechanism out there, it is always better to try to combine an approach coming from evolutionary psychology with one coming from cultural evolutionary theory? Or do you think it depends on the mechanism and perhaps some of them are better understood just through evolutionary psychology and others just through a cultural evolutionary lens?
That's a hard question because I think that it's certainly the case that there are some cognitive systems that, at least at a starting point, it's going to make more sense to start with an evolutionary psychology approach. So if you have a kind of cognitive system where you think, for example, maybe the sort of variation you would see across cultures is not likely to make a difference. So maybe that would, and this is a little bit off the top of my head, but maybe recognizing who your mother is, like maybe that you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a lot of variation across cultural contexts. So maybe that makes sense to really start with an evolutionary psychology approach. At the same time, there can be things that, like the examples of the learning to build canoes, right? So how that process works. Maybe that's the kind of process where it makes sense as a starting point to really start with the cultural evolutionary part and how do these cultural traits develop? How are they transmitted? But even in both of those cases, I think that if you really are going to have a full accounting of them, eventually you have to at least engage with what the other field would have to contribute. So, for example, what I'm saying about maybe there's not cultural variation in identifying your mother. Well, maybe there's not, but maybe there is. And so if you have already from an evolutionary psychology approach, if you have the psychology mapped out, then you can go and just look how this interfaces with human culture, and maybe the same is true with something like learning to build a canoe. So once you have how all of that once you have that process mapped out from a cultural evolutionary perspective, then it makes sense to look and say, well, does the structure of the human psychology receiving that, how does that interface? So artifact psychology, how does that interface with all of this? And I think that I would conceptualize it as a starting point. There's some things that are more useful one way or the other, but in the end, it's probably a good idea to at least check, because even very basic things like visual environment, right? Even that is very much influenced by a human culture. So which culture you're in, the visual environment changes. Does it matter? Maybe not, probably not, but maybe we should check. So this is I wouldn't draw hard lines, but I think it certainly is the case that some approaches are more useful as a starting point for different kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one last question regarding the social learning aspect of your work. So apart from acquiring new knowledge about how people acquire information from others, do you think that it can also help us understand how cultural knowledge becomes cumulative?
Yes, I think it can, because I think this is where the contribution from an evolutionary psychology perspective to the generation and transmission of human culture, I think this is where can be particularly useful. And that is that the kind of learning mechanism, the specialization in the learning mechanism that I have predicted and that I have been researching, it's not about it's not about characteristics of the learner or characteristics of the teacher. It's not about who to pay attention to or the kinds of biases that have been studied in social learning broadly. It's about the actual content, and the content that you're learning about is patterned based on what are the kinds of problems that humans have faced with respect to these things, and then how is the learning mechanism shaped around that. So my argument and my focus has been there's specialized learning shaped around plants, but it is, I would say it's likely also the case that there's specialized learning shaped around all kinds of different content, and that there's not going to be neat lines to draw between different kinds of content. So I think that I hope anyway that my work contributes thinking about what is the structure of the psychology around that is tailored around the kind of thing being learned about, and how does that interface with the social learning processes in terms of what is learned, what information is prioritized, what information makes its way into the culture in the first place, and how that information is patterned.
Mm-hmm. Great. So where can people find you and your work on the internet?
So my group is currently based at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, and so we have a website that has some of this work. If you look for the MPIB Baby Lab, we would show up. I have a Twitter handle that I should get better at using, which is just my name, Annie Wertz, and I'd say those are the two main places. And I am currently on the job market as the time we're recording this, and so I may have moved on, or maybe not by the time you see this. So I search my name, and you'll find wherever I am at the time you're seeing this video.
Okay, I will be leaving the links in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Wertz, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was really a very fun conversation, so thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this too. I've been looking forward to this, and this is as great as people say it is. So thank you very much again for inviting me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolfkin, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Max Belby. My producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.